The march began with a rhythm that felt like hunger, tapping on the ribs of the earth. Dawn slid over the palmettos and salt-wired grasses, turning dew into tiny shards of glass along the lips of the tents. The paymaster's box rattled somewhere near the commissary, a dry, stubborn clink that sounded like iron teeth snapping shut on a brittle truth. In the line of men waiting for their pay, Corporal Cale Zombarum stood still, the sleeve of his coat warmed by the smoke of a dozen small fires and the memory of a promise he could not break. On his left forearm, the marking C208 glowed faintly in the grey light, a code the men had chosen for him in mock ceremony and then kept as if it were a totem. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments raised in the Union Army, had earned their place in the history books by courage, by pain, and by the stubborn refusal to pretend that freedom cost nothing at all. Cale had signed his name with a certainty that had felt like a line drawn in the sand of his childhood home in New Bedford, where the smell of brine and coal smoke mingled with the memory of a mother who spoke softly about a son that would rise for everyone someday. He stood now in the uniform that would have made his father's skin prickle with pride and his mother's heart ache with fear, listening to the cotton tent sigh in the damp morning, listening to the wind do a small, merciless something to the sea beyond the bay. "Hold firm, C208, muttered a fellow private, a boy who still wore the edge of youth in his jaw and the fear in his eyes. His name was Amos Reed, though the men called him simply Reed, and there was a line of hunger across his cheek that the sun couldn't erase. He wore a patch of dirt like a medal, and in the lines of his mouth Kyle read the same stubborn hunger that gnawed at his own stomach. Reed bent to rummage in his knapsack, and the few tin cups clinked like coins the men were told not to spend. "Today they will pay us," Reed added, though the sentence sounded too thin for a promise, like a thread eroding away in rain. The hairs on Cale's forearm prickled. Hunger has a way of turning promises into tasks, into more honest accounts of what your hands can and cannot do. Kyle looked away from the paymaster's box and found the world in a dozen small scenes that kept him upright. Along the periphery, a line of wives and mothers stood with baskets, their eyes tired but searching for a father's or husband's hand to be returned with something more than a skin full of bread. The air carried the tang of cooking meat, but not in any reasonable quantity. The aroma came from someone's stew pot, done in the battery heat of a late morning. A taste of something that felt almost like a feast, but was only enough to remind you of what you ought to hate about hunger. The ground smelled of damp earth, smoke from campfires curling over the lips of the sea, and a metallic note that clung to the air whenever a man spoke more truth than he should. Behind him, in the simplest of ways, Cale could gauge what it had cost for them to stay. The 54th was a unit of men who had learned to move as if a single body, breath and bone and nerve, could outtire fear if the march would not end with a trick of mercy. Their stories overlapped like the seams of a garment, a grandmother's old shawl worn as a flag, a cousin's violin tucked away under a bed in a barracks that never slept through a night of a lullaby or a gunshot. The kidati, sir. First thing Kyle did that morning, though the thought had visited his days long before, was not to sign the line, not to accept the wages the paymaster tried to lay before them like a bribe. He did not say a word until the box stopped clinking, and the man who kept it in ironed silence straightened his back, pretending not to notice the group gathered before him. "We go on duty," Kyle said, the words coming loud enough for the men near him to hear, but soft enough not to wake the fear behind the paymaster's eyes. The cadence of his voice carried a weight the air could not pretend to misunderstand. There were men who would have paid to hear that voice say something else, endless, loud, and immediate. But Cale spoke only of a simple human right, and the oddness of it was that it felt revolutionary in the very moment he spoke. "The wages come later," the paymaster shot back, with a practiced casualness that did not reach his eyes. His mouth moved, but his hands did not, a trick of authority. "There's a line to be paid. We'll have it salted out before sunset. Do your duty." Kyle turned his gaze from the line to the face of the man who stood above the rest in a white shirt and creased cuffs, a man who had never had to choose between feeding his own child and feeding his family through the obligations of a country that promised liberty, but could barely spell out the word in a ledger. The man's name, if anyone bothered to know it, would come later as a word on a page that needed to be closed in a file. The line of men did not budge, but their posture changed. The rattle of the paybox might have been loud enough to crack the winter ice, but it did not melt the stubborn frost in their chests. Cale saw in the line the same features that had filled the old wharves of New Bedford, and the same expressions that haunted the nights of the free black families in Massachusetts. The quiet endurance of people who know that hunger can be as dangerous as a sword, and that to take a stand is to risk more than a meal. The tent flaps swelled in a breeze and then settled, as if the sea itself exhaled in sympathy. Fur sound like a wooden door being pried open carried across the yard. An officer with a glove on one hand, a clipboard in the other, a pen that tried to pretend it did not hum with resignation. The officer spoke to the box, though his words were for the air more than for the men. "You will be paid. You will be paid for your service," the officer said. He spoke as if the army's own logic would eventually outlive the pain of a hungry child and a stomach that growled a chorus every night. "In due time. The country cannot repay you with its food alone, but it will repay you with your due." The words tasted like copper on Kyle's tongue, a truth that the mouth could say and the heart could not swallow. He could not swallow the idea of due time, not when the time was measured in mornings of hunger, in nights where soup tasted of rain and iron, in the coughs of the men whose lungs betrayed them with every breath. He looked down at his own hands, calloused in places that told the stories of many a night when they learned to keep still in the dark, listening for a threat that might come as a whisper or a drumbeat. He did not move when Reed pressed his shoulder gently. "C-208, Reed whispered, and the nickname came out like a small friendly weapon. The men used it as a shield, as a way of saying, "We belong to something." Even when the world insists we have nothing left to give, days rolled forward with the same cadence of a drum that could not remember the purpose of its own march. The pay issue did not resolve itself with a polite apology tucked into a bottle of ink. It persisted, gnawing at the edges of every meal, of every shared blanket, of every prayer for a father or mother who might never taste the bite of bread again. The weather turned merciless in the low country, salt air and damp and the gnawing ache of absence. Cale's tent, a tangle of canvas and rope, became a small world where two senses collided every hour. The cold that numbed his fingertips and the warmth of a shared breath that reminded him that the men around him were a family stitched from the same fear. In the evenings, the men gathered to speak not of wages, but of the world that would come if the wages were finally paid. They spoke of home as if home were a map they could unroll on a table and study, a place where children played in sunlight, instead of counting the coins that did not arrive. They spoke of mothers who cleaned the same mug again and again for fear someone would mistake the mug for an empty one. They spoke of wives who braided hair with fingers stiff from worry and the wind that carried the scent of cornstalks, and frying fish from villages far beyond the sea islands, where the unit's boots had first learned to bite the earth. Why not simply leave? Kyle asked himself once in the quiet of his tent, when the rain slapped the canvas like a wary finger and the world outside sounded like a hungry animal. Why not turn away from the army that refused to feed you and your children? But then he would hear the voices again, the voices of the men who stood in line with him, and he would remember that their story was not a solitary one, that to quit would be to surrender the future to those who would build it for them, and the future had never needed more men to confront it than in that moment of crucible hunger. The rising action began with small, stubborn strokes, little acts of non-compliance that added up to a larger refusal. They did not stop marching when the whistle blew for parade, but they did not lift their feet as high. They pressed forward with a stubborn patience that said, "We will move, but not for wages that do not belong to us." They began to keep their pay, vouchers that the paymaster had offered them. He forced them to sign, or at least pretend to sign to, retrieve the next month's bread, and they placed them into a shared box in the center of the camp as if to say, "We will keep the money you have not yet paid us until the moment you realize you must pay us for the work we did do." The days grew longer in memory than in reality. The weather turned, stained with the smell of damp wool and the metallic tang of iron-rimmed cups. The men learned how to drink the bitter, unclear water in a way that made it seem almost sweet, like a victory snatched from the mouth of a rive. In their mouths, the taste of the army's haste remained, the slow, creeping hunger that never seemed to leave, the memory of a mother's lip that trembled when she was told that the money would come soon. The first real test came with a skirmish on the edge of a pine grove near a river, a place where the air hung heavy with resin and fear. The Confederate line appeared like a sudden black knot in the early mist. The sound of muskets and shouting pierced the air in a rapid-fire language Kyle had learned to translate into action. The unit moved into place with a discipline shaped by months of practice and the physical compulsion to keep the body in line even when the heart wanted to break away. The pay issue, however, remained an undercurrent in their movements, a thread that could pull the stitches of a perfectly formed line if someone pulled too hard. Pay or no pay? We hold, Kyle stated, the sentence short and loaded with a tone that told the men he was not asking but declaring. The men around him nodded in a chorus of silent agreement, their eyes flicking between the enemy and the ground and the sky, the possibility of honor and the probability of starvation. The battle began with a charge into the smoke and the shriek of metal against metal. The earth trembled with the steps of dozens of feet. The air tasted of rain and iron, the kind of humidity that made the lungs burn. The 54th's courage, the thing that had earned them their place, shone in the faces of men who refused to yield even when the world demanded quiet. Reed fought by Kyle's side, a constant, stubborn friend who could turn fear into action by simply squaring his shoulders and lifting his chin. The lines between fear and courage blurred, and their breath came in ragged, synchronized lungs. During the melee, a temporary silence fell over their small portion of the battlefield. In that pause, Kyle's ears caught the voice of a colonel not far away, hollering over the clash of rifles that the pay issue would soon be settled, that it would be considered a high priority. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to hear the words as a priest would speak them, not as a general would scrawl them onto a posted notice. The hunger pressed against his ribs, but the hunger did not steal his memory. The name of his son, the face of his mother, the memory of a grandmother who had taught him to wait for the world to be fair. When the smoke cleared, the men of the 54th held the ground, but at a cost that could never be paid by a ledger. The body of a young private lay at his feet, a boy who had joined the army to become more than a boy, and who now rested there as a symbol of the very thing the unit refused to yield, their humanity. Kyle's hands trembled as he eased the boy's rifle from his fingers and whispered a prayer that tasted like ash and salt on his tongue. The world around him moved with the mechanical precision of a ship at sea, the kind of motion that makes a person feel both small and necessary at the same time. That night, as the camp settled back into the quiet that follows a violent morning, Kyle's company gathered in the lantern light. The tea steamed in chipped mugs and the bread, hard as a stone but better than nothing, browned in the corner of a pan that had seen better days. The men spoke in low, careful tones, as if revealing too much could summon an enemy into the tent. Kyle listened, tasting the steam on his lips, feeling the rough texture of the bread against his tongue, the grit of the flour in his teeth. "We did not sign away our blood for coin," Reed said, voice rough with fatigue and something like awe. "We signed it for a nation that promised us liberty, and we will not let hunger rewrite that promise." "No," Kyle replied, his voice even but with a tremor that betrayed the weight of his own fear. "We did not fight to become beggars. We fight to become men equal to those who guard the gates of freedom." He paused, letting the word freedom cling to the air like smoke. "And if it takes 18 months or 18 years, we will wait for what is ours." The words settled into the space between them, a compact as moral as it was stubborn. The paybox remained, a brass throat that would not swallow the truth. But now the truth had a thickening of resolve behind it, a texture that could not be shaved away by a clerk's careful handwriting. Rising action continued with more episodes of small rebellion, each scene infused with the salt and blood of war, and with the quiet persistence of a people who have learned to count not by days, but by the number of mouths fed that day. Kyle found that his own strength did not come from the fear he faced, but from the fear he faced with others, from the way a line of men would hold together when the world pressed in from all sides and the ground itself seemed to crumble with the weight of hunger. There came a day when a message arrived from Governor Andrews in Boston, a letter so formal and so carefully worded that Kyle almost did not recognize it as a letter that could mean anything at all. The governor wrote of pay, of the long line of accounts that must be settled, and of justice that would be served in due course. The tone suggested a distant mercy rather than a direct intervention, as if the state could afford to be generous only after the war had consumed its last breath and kept the men who fought for it from starving. The note traveled through the camp with the care of a gossip and the gravity of a church bell, muting some voices and amplifying others. That letter arrived on a morning when a cold wind swept over the camp, lifting the smell of damp wool and the sourness of fear out of the bunks and into the open air. Kyle stood at the edge of the line, his breath forming a pale cloud in the grey light. The world behind him a blur of tarps and steam and the faint, stubborn glow of morning. The men around him watched for a sign, some symbol that would translate the governor's promise into something tangible. In the end, the sign did not come as a dramatic proclamation. It was a series of small, practical steps, an adjustment of pay rates, a direct deposit into a communal fund to be distributed to families, a promise of rations that would be delivered to those whose homes had become the edge of famine. It was not the thunderclap of justice, but the steady rhythm of a drum that would not stop. The drum of a country that finally admitted that its promise was not a warm ideal, but a set of duties owed to the people who made the country possible. Weeks turned into months in that way, with the war pressing on in the background, and the pay issue becoming a background chorus that the men learned to ignore or to listen to with a different ear. Kyle watched as the world changed around him, the white flags that would occasionally appear among the trees, as if signaling retreat, and the occasional flare of color that told a more complex story than just surrender or victory. He stood with his unit at a point where the land smelled of pine and gunpowder, and he sensed that the true battle was not the one that men counted on the map, but the one that took place in their own chests, where fear could either eat away at them or become the fuel that pushed them to endure. The 18-month mark arrived with the sound no one cared to welcome, the sound of a letter being opened and the handwriting inside telling a story not of victory but of survival. The text described wages settled, an acknowledgement of unpaid work, and a distribution plan that would ensure no family would starve if another month of war demanded more than bread. The balance of fear and relief felt in the camp was a tangible thing. The air smelled of relief and old iron, the dry rattle of a bottle of water in a tin cup, the soft, exhausted sigh of men who had learned how to trust a promise only after the miles of marching and the hours of hunger. In that moment, Kyle did not celebrate with a roar. He did not lift his voice to the heavens as a sign of victory. Instead, he looked at the faces around him, the eyes that had learned to meet his, the lips that carried stories of wives and children, the hands that worked relentlessly to fill the gap between what was owed and what was given. And he whispered to Reed, "We stood until the last coin came home." Reed smiled, and for a moment the tent glowed with a peculiar light, not from the lanterns, but from the simple fact that a line of men had refused to surrender their humanity to a ledger. The resolution of the story did not erase the cost. They had endured hunger and fear. They had faced the risk of punishment for their refusal, and the weight of a war that wore them down day by day. The army did not grant them a hero's feast. It offered instead a compact, a more equitable approach to pay, and a promise to never let such a wrong repeat itself in the same way. The families who had waited with patient despair and brittle hope began to see a light in their windows again. Their children could drink a small cup of milk instead of water and flour. The elder caregivers could purchase a little more salt and a few more dried beans, enough to keep the hunger from turning into sickness. The soldiers' hunger, which had once tasted of copper and rust, began to taste like a future. The coin, when it came, was not merely a reimbursement. It was a symbol that the country had listened, that the men who carried its banner would not be left to bear the weight of its wrongs alone. The pay came with a quiet dignity. It did not shout from the rooftops, but it did glow in the faces of the men who had stood with Kyle, whose names would be whispered by younger soldiers as if they were saints and legends rather than ordinary men. The final moments of the campaign that Kyle would remember were not the most glorious. Fought. There were no banners exploding into fire, no thunder of drums, no flags raised in the smoke of a battlefield. They arrived at a small hill overlooking a harbor town, a place where the river turned and the sea began again into a quiet horizon. The light on the water was pale and patient, as if time itself wanted to take a breath. Kyle stood at the edge of the hill with Reed and a few others, their uniforms strained by the weather, their faces pale from months of discipline and worry, their eyes tired but clear with the kind of courage that does not need to shout to prove its existence. The sun rose like a pale gold spill across the water, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "Look at that light," Reed whispered, and the breath of fear that he had worn like a cloak every morning for 15 months loosened its grip. "We did not have this waiting for us when we started." "No," Kyle replied, his voice low, almost a vow. "But we have it now because we refused to let hunger erode us. We stood as men, and the country learned to stand with us." In the days that followed, the unit did not disappear from the pages of history as a mere footnote to the war. The 54th remained a symbol, the symbol of a regiment that did not surrender its men to the mercy of a system that had long treated black labor as the cheapest kind of labor. The world learned to listen to the voices that spoke from the lines of hungry men, to the mothers with furrowed brows who waited for the mail that would deliver the money that would feed their children, to the wives who stood at the end of docks and wharves and prayed that the soldiers would come home with dignity as well as victory. Cale did not stop being Kyle after the payment came in. He remained a man who bore witness to the truth that the body can survive the worst possible assault so long as the soul does not forget its duty to others. He did not forget the boy who had died on the field, nor the old woman who had held the boy's mother's hand as she cried for a death taller than any hill or trench. He did not forget how the hunger of his people dragged the country toward a reckoning that would become, in some measure, the seed of a more honest future. The legend of C208, the name by which they had nicknamed him in the trenches, the mark on his sleeve, and the unspoken vow he wore on his heart, grew past the edges of their camp. In letters carried by messengers who spoke in quiet, careful tones about the bravery of a man who refused a just wage, to the point that the army could not ignore him, the name appeared in the margins of newspapers, in sermons that spoke of liberty and of the debt owed to those who had risked their lives without the guarantee that their families would eat, in the voices of grandmothers who told their grandchildren that the road to freedom is paved with the stubborn, daily acts of those who choose to endure rather than betray their own hunger. The final image Cale kept of his unit and their long, hungry 18 months was of a line of men walking forward together, shoulder to shoulder, their steps in time with the drumbeat of a country learning to become willing to pay what it owed, not with coins alone, but with the idea that every life matters, every family deserves a meal, and every soldier deserves respect. The axis of his memory turned toward a hope that would not die, the memory of the day when the box of pay would finally be emptied with a sense of justice, not simply of relief, and in the quiet that followed, when the bells of the harbor town rang the hours of the day, and the gulls cried out above the water, as if to remind the living that life goes on beyond war. Kyle pressed his palm to the scar that ran along the back of his hand, where a piece of shrapnel once found a home. The iron tasted in his mouth, and he could smell the sea vinegar of salt, the old iron of a musket he had carried into more battles than he could count, the bread he ate that morning that had tasted like a small miracle. He thought of his mother's voice and his father's quiet endurance, of all the people who would never know the sound of a paycheck landing in a pocket, who would never know the small relief of a full stomach. And he whispered to the wind a line that had become his own creed and the creed of those he served with. "We are not defined by hunger or pay, but by the courage with which we face both and the stubborn dignity with which we refuse to surrender." In time, the army wrote itself into a better history, and Cale's name, C208, Zombaram, hung on the lips of those who remembered a time when a people, when a family, and when a nation learned to be honest about the price of freedom. The ending was not a triumphant roar, but a quiet, hard-won conclusion. The fight that matters most is not merely against a foe in the field, but against the injustice that gnaws at those who fight to keep a country honest. The 18 months of hunger ended not with a feast, but with an agreement that fed more than hunger, an agreement that recognized the humanity of men who had earned more than a ledger could ever tally, and so the story of C208 Zombaram, of a soldier who would not be bought by a price that did not include the families at his back, passed into memory as a testament to endurance, a reminder that the line in the sand is drawn not by the strength of one man alone, but by the collective will of many who refused to yield their humanity for a paycheck. The war did end. The pay did come. The families were fed again, and the name C208 Zombaram became more than a number or a code. It became the living symbol of a vow kept under the most brutal of skies, a testament that in the darkest hours no one deserts, and no one speaks for justice more clearly.